Hi, thank you everyone for holding. We're just waiting for all the commissioners to join and then we will start the meeting. Thank you everyone for holding. We're just waiting on all of the commissioners to join and then we can start the meeting. All right, thank you everyone. Now that all commissioners have joined the meeting, we are now turning on your ability to start your video and audio.
Ethan, I just sent you an email saying I was having trouble getting in, but I'm in.
All
I
right,
was thinking I was in on the wrong link, but I think I must be okay.
good, very good. And I believe that all of the commissioners have joined us now, and I believe that all of them have video up and running except for Commissioner Ariner. That's obviously up to you. You're muted with no video at the moment, but that's up to you. But Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Sidley is not going to be able to join us today, so all the commissioners are present, so we can begin whenever you'd like.
Maybe you can update me on, are there any of the electeds participating?
There are not. We know that Senator Nielsen will not be able to join, and Assemblymember Mays will not be able to join. We have not heard from Senator Roth or Assemblymember Quirk, but I do not expect that they will be able to join.
Thank you, because I certainly didn't want to introduce them if they're not with us.
Yes, yes.
So why don't we go ahead and call the meeting to order. This is the public hearing on labor trafficking today, Thursday, May 28th of 2020. I want to thank all of you for joining us. My name is Pedro Nava, and I'm the chairman of the Little Hoover Commission. Before we begin, I want to thank all of you for your patience as we learn how to navigate and adapt to these unprecedented times. This is the commission's first ever virtual hearing. I'd like to introduce the other commissioners who are here with us on Zoom. Joining us today is Vice Chair Sean Varner, Commissioners Cynthia Buisa and the Honorable Dion Ehrener, who are the subcommittee for this labor trafficking study. Also joining us are Commissioners David Byer, Commissioner Emerson, Bill Emerson, and Kathy Schwamberger. Thank you for being with us. Also is our staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick and Deputy Director Tamar Foster, who is also the project manager for this study. Project Manager Crystal Beckham and Analyst Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Medioli are also with us. Let me do some housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. The Commissioner's audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of our hearing, excuse me. The video and audio of our hearing, witnesses will be turned on when it is their turn to speak. Members of the public will be muted during the hearing. As is standard for the commission, we will have a public comment session at the end. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during the public comment session. If you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. If you decide you don't want to make a comment, click on the icon again and lower your hand. Those who have joined us by phone may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, indicating you want to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you have joined the meeting so that our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails, requesting comment throughout the duration of the hearing. As is usual at commission meetings, public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the meeting, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to the YouTube channel. Now let me turn to the critically important topic of today's hearing. Labor trafficking is a horrific form of modern slavery that tragically affects the lives of many men, women, and children across California. State efforts to combat trafficking have largely focused on targeting sex traffickers, as well as protecting and providing services to victims of sex trafficking. This vital work, carried out by numerous state government officials, departments, and organizations, plays a pivotal role in stemming the spread of this terrible abuse. However, the nature of labor trafficking makes it more difficult to detect, and therefore more difficult for state and law enforcement officials to combat. Victims may appear to be compensated for legitimate work, or the work may occur within the context of an otherwise legitimate business. Yet labor exploitation is occurring all around us, from agricultural fields to beauty salons and numerous other industries. California must focus on identifying labor trafficking alongside other forms of human trafficking. We must ensure that criminals are prosecuted and that victims and survivors are protected so that these human rights abuses are prevented from happening in the future. That's why the commission launched a study last fall on the state's response to labor trafficking. We started this study with a hearing in San Diego, at which the President Pro Tem of the California Senate, Senator Toni Atkins, introduced the issue. We want to thank Senator Atkins for her participation and for her leadership. We heard from survivors and their advocates, expert researchers, and local officials on the significant impact labor trafficking has upon individuals, families, and communities. At our advisory committee meeting in January, we convened state and federal officials, legal experts, and service providers to discuss how California can better identify and respond to labor trafficking. Today, we will hear from state officials representing numerous departments about the vital work that they do to identify and combat labor trafficking in California and bring justice to the victims and survivors of this terrible crime. We anticipate issuing a report soon that will recommend policy changes to the governor and the legislature. Before we begin our hearing this morning, I'd like to ask Commissioner Buisa, Chair of our Labor Trafficking Study Subcommittee, to please say a few words. Commissioner Buisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, fellow commissioners, and thank you for joining us in today's hearing. As the chairman pointed out, labor trafficking is a critical issue in California and in this country, and one that is too often overlooked. I am honored to lead this study subcommittee along with Commissioner Arener. Our goal is not only to increase public awareness of this crime, but also change the way our state government responds. We know that there are countless victims across our state who have been exploited for their labor. Many of them are not even aware that they are victims of crime. Often, they are not aware that they have rights and deserve protection. As Chairman Nava said, labor trafficking does not discriminate. Whether you're male or female, young or old, citizen or immigrant, labor traffickers prey upon the most vulnerable. It is our duty to ensure that California protects these victims and survivors and prosecutes the criminals to the best of its ability and bring them to justice. The testimonies we heard at our first hearing and our advisory committee meeting point to a significant need for statewide coordination and the creation of lasting solutions in responding to this heinous crime. We are looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the state's role in combating labor trafficking, what we are doing, and what more we could do. To all our witnesses, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. Your knowledge and expertise are vital, and we are very grateful that you have agreed to share your expertise with us so that we could further enrich this report. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Buisa. I'd like to echo her and expressing our appreciation to our witnesses for their dedication to fighting labor trafficking in California. And now, Mr. Rarick, if you could please introduce our first witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first witness is Dominic Forrest. Mr. Forrest is Chief of the Labor Enforcement Task Force at the Department of Industrial Relations. The task force is a coalition of state government enforcement agencies that work together with local agencies to combat the underground economy and practices such as tax evasion, cash pay, and wage theft. Mr. Forrest has provided written testimony, which the commissioners have, and then he'll be available to answer questions from the commission. Also with us today from the Department of Industrial Relations are two of Mr. Forrest's colleagues who will also be available to answer questions. Jessica Frye is a trial attorney for the Labor Commissioner for the state of California with an extensive background in California employment law, particularly the enforcement of the labor code. I might note she's based in San Diego, where, as the commissioner noted, we held our first hearing on this topic. And previously, she was a community organizer and worked in public interest law, including an immigrant rights center in Mexico. Also with us from the department is Patricia Alatorre. She is Deputy Labor Commissioner in the Retaliation Complaint Investigation Unit at the Department of Industrial Relations. She's held that position since June of 2017. That unit investigates workplace retaliation complaints, such as reduction in pay or hours or unfair immigration-related practices. So I'll ask Mr. Forrest to testify now. Mr. Forrest.
Good morning. This is Dominic Forrest. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you very much for this opportunity to address the Little Hoover Commission today and provide an update on behalf of the Department of Industrial Relations on this very important topic. My name is Dominic Forrest. I'm the Chief of the Labor Enforcement Task Force with the Department of Industrial Relations, also known as DIR. The mission of DIR is to improve working conditions for California's wage earners and to advance opportunities for profitable employment in California. DIR administers and enforces laws governing wages, hours and breaks, overtime, retaliation, workplace safety and health, apprenticeship training programs, medical care, and other benefits for injured workers. Through our efforts to protect vulnerable workers, DIR collaborates with various partner agencies to support the collective effort to combat labor trafficking. DIR does not have authority to investigate labor trafficking cases or have staff or resources dedicated to specifically combat labor trafficking. An example of our collaborative cross-agency efforts is the work of LETF. LETF is the Labor Enforcement Task Force. So LETF, under the direction of DIR, is a coalition of California state agencies. We work together to share information and resources to focus on combating the underground economy. In this joint effort, we're focusing on ensuring workers are paid properly, have a safe working environment, and law-abiding businesses have the opportunity for healthy competition. Some of the LETF partner agencies include, within DIR, the Labor Commissioner's Office, the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, DOSH, also known as CalOSHA, the Employment Development Department, the Contractors License Board, the California Department of Justice, and several other agencies. LETF targets several low-wage, high-hazard industries where underground economy activity is prevalent, and labor trafficking is also known to occur in some of these industries, which include restaurants, construction, agriculture. And since DIR is committed to worker protection, our staff are often interacting with workers who could be potential victims of labor trafficking. Therefore, LETF has developed a partnership with the California DOJ, the Department of Justice, where we've set up a referral process where if our staff notice potential signs of trafficking when they're doing inspections on at work sites or at businesses, the staff member will note down all the details, report it to their manager, and we'll make a referral to DOJ.
Excuse me, can I interrupt? Mr.
Yes,
Chairman?
Yes.
I apologize that I have to leave for another board meeting at 10 o'clock. So I wanted to use this opportunity to thank all of the witnesses for participating and thank each of you for what you do every day to help people in the difficult labor market, which sadly I believe is going to get more difficult over time. I want to go back to 2015 when Little Hoover Commission issued a report on the underground economy. And it's a very long report, and I don't expect that many people remember it. I think the chairman and I are the only commissioners still left from that time. But in that report, we identified the possibility of potential coalitions between legitimate businesses and labor, especially organized labor, in dealing with people who were abused in the same industries that Mr. Forrest is talking about. The core of the report, however, was notwithstanding many agencies, the difficulties of enforcement and the lack of resources and the lack of focus and accountability was getting in the way of making a meaningful dent in the underground economy. I fear that we're 5 years later and the situation hasn't changed. And it's not because the people who are witnesses today haven't been doing their job. It's a really hard thing to do, to coordinate across agencies and to deal with shrinking budgets in some instances. So my question for the witness, and it's basically the same question for everybody. Given the magnitude of the problem, are we essentially scaled at the right level and led by a entity, a person with a singular focus on the problem, which is the underground economy and labor trafficking? Or is a piecemeal approach that we have today with multiple agencies the best we can do?
I can provide an answer on behalf of the Labour Enforcement Task Force, some of the work we're doing. Whereas, as I mentioned, the Labour Enforcement Task Force is under the direction of DIR. And so, as you mentioned, we have, since that report, focused our efforts on really sharing resources. So in terms of focusing our focus on labor laws and the underground economy, we are collaborating with all our partners, as I mentioned before, the Employment Development Department, Contractor State License Board, because as the report pointed out, the underground economy, it's not just one type of violation, which is the problem. It's a lot of the times when we do inspections, we find that if there's, for example, wage theft which is something the Labour Commissioner's Office looks into, there's also a high probability that there are some health and safety violations, possibly some tax payroll reporting violations. Also, licensing violations. That's why we collaborate with the Contractor State License Board for construction enforcement. So that's some of the efforts we're doing. We're really focusing on, before actually doing the actual inspections, we're focusing on sharing data, doing data matching, checking the Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau for workers' compensation coverage, and trying to put together a picture before we do enforcement, so we have a pretty good idea of trying to target the egregious violators who are violating multiple labor and tax laws.
So let me just follow up with one question, and then I'll back off a little bit. So I just want to understand the order of magnitude of the problem and the amount of resources. So I'll make some guesses. Let's assume in the state of California, like 40 million people, that there are somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 people who are trapped at any point in time, and that we have fewer than 100 people in all agencies involved in enforcement. Is that more or less accurate?
I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to speculate on those numbers, because with what our department does, the Department of Industrial Relations, we do collaborate with other law enforcement partners. I'm afraid because we don't specifically prosecute labor trafficking cases, we're not really in a position to state the magnitude of the problem, I'm afraid.
Okay, that tells me a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman Nava, I just wanted to really reinforce that question from Commissioner Buyer, because the issue of scale, I think, is very important. And I hope that we can pursue that angle of inquiry as we move forward, because that is the infrastructure up to the top, I think, is a big issue for me.
Right. And I think the point that Commissioner Buyer made was that it's not a reflection on any particular agency or entity or people in those positions. It is whether or not there has been a focus, so that if we can confirm or get information when he's talking about the numbers in the state that are likely to be trafficked, a reasonable projection, and then how many people have the responsibility of actually conducting enforcement. and the different kinds of enforcement. Because without a focus, then I think we're not even treading water. But Mr. Forrest, I should let you know that you should be flattered whenever you're interrupted by this commission, because it means that we are listening to what you have to say, and then we're following up with questions that will help us focus and get very pointed with our recommendations.
Excellent, thank you. And referring back to our collaboration with the California Department of Justice, in May 2018, Amanda Plisner, Deputy Attorney General and Statewide Human Trafficking Coordinator for DOJ, who will be testifying a bit later on also, provided a training to our LETF staff. The training covered definitions of human and labor trafficking and how our staff could look out for potential signs of trafficking when they are doing inspections and interacting with workers. So we found that incredibly helpful for our staff and helped us play a role in this important effort. We also wanted to share a bit of information from various units within the Labour Commissioner's Office, also known as the LCO. The LCO enforces the Labour Code, and in doing so often encounters vulnerable workers, makes referrals, and collaborates with various law enforcement partners. The LCO is best known for helping workers who have not been paid their wages, but the Labour Commissioner's Office also houses a criminal investigations unit and a retaliation complaint investigations unit, all of which may interact with victims of labour trafficking. The LCO legal unit analyzes requests for certification for U or T visas by workers who report certain crimes, including trafficking. In the U or T visa process, we are a certifying agency. Our role as a certifying agency is limited in that the victim submits a signed certification request, which we then investigate. The certification gives USCIS basic information about the criminal activity of trafficking and lets USCIS know that the worker reported the crime and is assisting with the prosecution of the crime. Our certification confers no immigration status or protection on the employee, but if USCIS grants a petition, the employee gets temporary immigration status, including work status, temporary immigration status for certain family members of the victim, and also the possibility of lawful permanent resident status.
Let me ask you a question. This is Pedro Nava. Have you seen any change in the frequency of the granting of the status over the last couple of years?
I'd like to defer that question to Jessica Frye, who's also available. She's one of the leads of that program.
Fine, if Ms. Frye could keep that in mind. Thank you.
I think hopefully Jessica might be available.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Frye is on, and I think she could answer your question now, probably.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Hello.
Yeah, hello, thank you. So it depends on whether it's a U or a T visa. There is a cap on the number of U visas and T visas per year that are granted by USCIS. And the cap for U visas is reached every year. And so it takes probably between 7 to 10 years for a U visa to be granted. For a T visa, they don't typically, which T is specific. U visas are for a variety of different crimes, including the California version of or definition of labor trafficking, whereas the T visa is only for the federal definition of labor trafficking. It's a different kind of relief. And the T visa, they don't reach that cap every year. I think that it depends on whether the person is in removal proceedings or not. It typically takes a few years. That has been consistent in the 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this.
Great, thank you.
And with the issue of retaliation, retaliation is one of the most pressing and persistent challenges to effective enforcement of our workplace laws. Workers should not fear that their employer will punish them for asserting their rights, yet unfortunately retaliation is quite common. The Retaliation Complaint Investigation Unit involvement in the area of labor trafficking consists of 3 elements. The first element is prevention, through ensuring that workers have access to information about their rights and employers know their responsibilities about California labor law. The second element is investigating complaints of retaliation to determine the extent of the retaliation and to prevent the effect of retaliation on other employees. And finally, the third element is to identify cases that should be referred to our legal department, our criminal investigations unit, or other law enforcement partners. And we'd like to end with recommendations. In order to strengthen the state's response to labor trafficking, we would recommend continuing training and outreach efforts to stakeholders and the public. We feel that a collaborative approach is needed to advance best practices in preventing trafficking and to improve outcomes for survivors. And that concludes our written statement.
Thank you. So let's open it up to commissioners if they have any comments or questions based on what they've heard so far. I do understand that there are a couple of other people, is that correct, Mr. Forrest, that are available to answer questions?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, Jessica
right.
And then Patricia Alatorre is also on the line from our Retaliation Unit in the Labor Commissioner's Office.
Thank you.
Chairman, I'd like to go back to a couple of questions to follow up with Ms. Frye on the UNT visas.
Sure.
Did I hear that right, that once a potential victim has provided information requesting certification for a UNT visa, it takes 7 to 10 years for that to be granted?
That is for USCIS to grant it. Our certification process is much shorter. It depends on each individual case, but I would guess that it takes between 14 days and 3 months for us to do the certification. But then after that, it gets submitted to USCIS, and there's a tremendous backlog.
What happens to the victim during that time frame?
In the past, it was as a humanitarian visa. People were USCIS did not go after those people in terms of deportation efforts. I don't think that we can make that guarantee anymore, or even. I think that they are very much at risk. Once they submit that documentation to USCIS, they are very much at risk of deportation efforts by the federal government.
Are these individuals here illegally, or are they on expired visas, or a combination of both?
Yes, a combination of both. I mean, some people have come over with valid work visas and then become victims of labor trafficking. Others came over without any sort of inspection at entry and began working. Some people were recruited from their home country. It comes in a myriad of forms. It very rarely comes to you in a case of somebody being a literal slave and being held by whips and chains. It's usually a combination of extortion and threats and a bundle of labor exploitation.
So in other words, there are some people that were forced to come to the country to work here illegally, and now they're here. And so it's a question of how do we treat them humanely and get them through a process in order if they have a desire to stay.
Correct, or they may have come over on a work visa, such as the J visa program, and ended up the J visa is typically for like au pairs, and they may have come over with the correct paperwork to work, and then they become victims of trafficking within that home. So
just one quick follow-up question on that. So is there a methodology that, or even if this is a viable solution, but is there a methodology by tracking those visas when they expire to determine if that, I know that there's the issue with if the visa's expired, someone may feel vulnerable to being deported, but is there a way of tracking those visas to determine if someone may be subject to labor trafficking because the visa's expired and we haven't heard from them?
That would not be something that we would have access to. Also, a person can be in any, a person can be from the United States and be a victim of trafficking. It isn't necessarily the lack of work authorization that makes them a victim. It's the fact that they're more vulnerable or more susceptible to trafficking because of their unlawful status.
No, I understand. This was just one segment. I was looking at a possible way of one segment of a solution to the problem. And I know it's much more vast than that. So thank you. I appreciate your response.
Thank you. Any other commissioners?
This is Dion Eriner. So I'm interested in following up on Commissioner Byer's questions regarding what do we know about numbers? And that, so if it's not within the DIR's respective jurisdiction to keep track of numbers, is it someplace else? I mean, because as Commissioner Buiza mentioned, it's hard to start a conversation without knowing the size of the problem, because then it's one thing to know what the solutions might be, but the other thing is to know what the cost of those solutions are. And so I'm wondering if are there statistics somewhere in the state of California that tell us, that estimate, or at least tell us, or has anybody studied what they think the numbers are of people that are being labor trafficked in the state of California?
Good question.
Commissioner, this is Ethan. I think that I don't know that there are precise numbers. I don't know if Mr. Forrest has anything to contribute. We are going to hear shortly from the Department of Justice. I don't know if they have exact numbers, but I believe that there is not strong comprehensive data on that across the state. I believe that's one of the fundamental problems.
Okay, thank you.
And I should note, by the way, for commissioners that Tamar, who is, as you know, is the lead on this study, is not available to be here due to a family emergency today. So she would know more about that than I do, and I apologize that she's not available today. So.
Well, thank you for that. I'm guessing that we've probably exhausted at this point questions from commissioners on this part of the hearing. So if that is the case, then I want to thank Mr. Forrest, Ms. Frye, and Ms. Alatorre for their contribution, for participating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So maybe we can go to prosecuting labor trafficking cases.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have two witnesses to discuss prosecution efforts of labor trafficking cases. Kevin Kish from the Director of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing will speak first, and then Amanda Plisner from the Department of Justice, and then they will both be available for questions from the commissioners. Mr. Kish provided written testimony, which the commissioners have in front of them. Mr. Kish was appointed by Governor Brown as Director of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing in February of 2015. The department is the largest state civil rights agency in the nation and protects California's residents from unlawful discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations, and from hate violence and human trafficking. After Mr. Kish speaks, we'll hear from Amanda Plisner, who is the Deputy Attorney General and Statewide Human Trafficking Coordinator at the Department of Justice. She works with various local, state, and federal agencies to investigate and prosecute complex multi-jurisdictional cases throughout the state and to coordinate anti-human trafficking initiatives. So with that, Mr. Kish.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you to the commissioners for inviting me and to everyone for being so flexible with this remote technology. I'm not going to read my written comments word for word. I'll just hit on some points. And I wanted to start with a response to the last question about numbers. The best source of numbers that I'm aware of is from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which does break down reported cases state by state. And these numbers are collected by the California Attorney General. So I'm sure Ms. Plisner will be able to speak to those numbers when it comes her time. So as you heard, DFVH is the state civil rights agency. We enforce a broad range of civil rights laws, including laws prohibiting discrimination in employment and housing, but also laws that prohibit hate violence and human trafficking. We have the power to enforce the California Trafficking Victims Protection Act in civil actions. We are a relatively unique entity, both in the state of California, but also nationally, in that we receive, like many of our state partners around the country, complaints directly from members of the public or their advocates. We also, though, have the authority to initiate complaints or charges in our own name. And we are required by statute to investigate everything that comes to us that falls within our jurisdiction. So each year we investigate thousands of complaints of discrimination and other civil rights violations. Something that makes us relatively unique in the nation is that our lawyers, once we find a violation, have the authority to file lawsuits directly in court rather than go through an administrative hearing or some other adjudication forum. So we file civil lawsuits, we seek damages, and we vindicate the interests of the state in eradicating discrimination, harassment, hate violence, etc. Let's see. So I want to spend just a moment talking about the civil remedy for human trafficking. As you all have heard from speakers at your November hearing, California's Trafficking Victims Protection Act is a landmark law. It included both some criminal and civil penalties for both sex and labor trafficking, as well as other victim protections. And DFVH gained the authority to enforce the civil aspect of the law in 2016, beginning January 1st, 2017, after the passage of AB 1684. So we have the authority to receive complaints, to mediate them, to prosecute civil complaints alleging violations of Civil Code 52.5, which is the civil anti-trafficking statute. The civil cause of action is regarded by advocates as really crucial, sometimes alongside of a criminal prosecution, but often when there is no criminal prosecution. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I'm just gonna touch on a couple of highlights. One, the burden of proof in civil cases is a preponderance of the evidence standard, as opposed to a beyond a reasonable doubt standard that you have in criminal prosecutions. This allows cases to be brought in one that might not be brought by criminal prosecutors, especially in contexts, if you think about domestic servitude, where there may be literally no witnesses to the events other than the trafficking victim and the traffickers themselves. A crucial element of civil actions is the availability of compensatory damages and punitive damages. And as I think you know, California's trafficking statute provides for treble damages. So these types of monetary compensation in civil proceedings can dwarf criminal restitution when there is a prosecution, because in criminal cases, courts may not award non-economic damages. Another crucial aspect of civil prosecution and civil litigation is that you can hold liable entities and individuals who you might not be able to hold criminally liable through various theories of liability, including joint employment, aiding and abetting statutes. And in this way, you can strike a blow at the networks that perpetuate human trafficking, at the interests that profit from it, even if the folks involved in those networks and interests are not themselves directly engaged in the trafficking situation. Finally, I just want to add, as a law enforcement agency, DFVH, like the Department of Industrial Relations and the Labor Commissioner's Office, as a law enforcement agency, can and does certify UNT visa petitions, meaning we certify that an immigrant has been the victim of trafficking or certain other crimes, so that they can then present their petition to the United States government seeking visa status. I'll spend a moment talking about barriers to civil enforcement. The reality is we have received almost no human trafficking complaints since we received the authority to prosecute them in 2017. In the past 2 years, we've received a total of 31 human trafficking complaints, but almost none of those have actually involved trafficking facts. So the bottom line is that people who have filed trafficking complaints with DFEH typically have not been victims of human trafficking, while survivors of human trafficking have typically not chosen to file with us. And I think I can shed a little bit of light on why that is so based on my personal experience before joining the state and DFEH, where I worked in legal aid at Bethesda Legal Services in Los Angeles, litigating labor trafficking cases along with other underground economy cases. So I provided representation and legal services to many dozens of trafficking survivors. I litigated several labor trafficking cases. And along with co-counsel, I tried and won the first civil case to reach a jury verdict under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of California. And in that case, our client spoke publicly about this very strong desire to hold her traffickers personally responsible. She wanted to take them to court and make them answer for what they had done. This makes her very unique in my experience among survivors. Her case does illustrate the advantages of civil litigation. The restitution that she was awarded in a criminal proceeding for 2 months of domestic servitude before she escaped totaled around $1,300, which represented lost wages. The civil jury awarded her more than $750,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. So that gives you a very concrete example of the importance of civil litigation in eradicating trafficking and holding traffickers to account. Very, very, very few of the many survivors that I represented chose to file a civil action, and their reasons were complex. Many of them feared for family members in their countries of origin, those who were immigrants, vulnerable to the same trafficking networks that ensnared them in the first place. But one really crucial aspect of civil litigation brought by trafficking survivors is that they control it in a way that they do not control criminal prosecution. They do not make the choice to bring criminal charges. They serve as the state's witness in a criminal proceeding. They aren't in control. In civil litigation, traditionally they are. They have lawyers who represent their interests. So think about what that means in the context of state enforcement and DFEH enforcement of this statute. So complainants in our process have a statutory right to intervene in a lawsuit that we bring, but it is our lawsuit. So they can have their own lawyer, they can intervene in the lawsuit to protect their own interests, but they cannot control our decision. They cannot dictate the litigation choices that we make. And so the United States Supreme Court, in the context of interpreting the powers of one of our federal analogs, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, has described the EEOC as the master of its own case and the power to determine whether public resources should be committed in certain ways and in certain cases. And that holds true for us as well, even without the complainant's consent or agreement. So to sum that up, most survivors of labor trafficking choose never to move forward with a civil action for various reasons. For those who do, there is a pro bono bar of attorneys who are willing to represent these survivors. They are supported by a nationwide network of pro bono resources, including the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Network out of DC. And so it should not come as a surprise to us that survivors who decide to file civil actions would typically not choose to hand their case to a state agency that they don't control. With that said, I do think there are a couple areas where DFEH and the state as a whole are well positioned to intervene in civil litigation combating trafficking. So first of all, some survivors may choose to file complaints with us in the future. I think particularly in areas of the state where there is less of a private bar and less of a robust pro bono network, and we're ready to accept and investigate those complaints. But we also have the power to initiate complaints in our own name, either as a director's complaint under my name or on behalf of a group or class of people, whether or not we receive a complaint from an individual. So we use this tool now to conduct systemic investigations into potential violations of the laws that we enforce, violations that affect maybe an entire workplace, violations that involve many individual victims, some or all of whom would never have filed a complaint on their own behalf. And again, these might be triggered by an individual complaint, but they don't have to be. We can simply initiate them. It can be a referral from another government agency or other sources. So in this context of investigation, our powers are similar to those of a grand jury. We can initiate an investigation merely because we suspect that the law might be violated, because we want assurance that it is not being violated. And so I think that DFEH, in collaboration with some of the state agencies that you're hearing from today, is well equipped to bring civil actions on behalf of a group of trafficking survivors, perhaps in scenarios where none of them would have chosen on their own to come forward and file a civil action. There are structural benefits to the state doing that. For example, we do not have to meet class certification requirements in our group or class litigation because we're representing the interests of the state as opposed to the private class. In our current structure at DFEH, we don't have peace officers. You heard from DIR, they do. We don't have a field enforcement team that is equipped to go out into the field and identify trafficking scenarios. But other state entities do have these powers. And so a robust referral mechanism between and among these agencies would allow us to initiate in our own name civil investigations in appropriate cases, again, even where individual victims would never choose to come forward. Those are the remarks that I had prepared, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Commissioners, questions?
Chair Nava, I have a question.
Certainly.
Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your time with us this morning. I'm just curious because in the documents that we reviewed, it said that to date you have not received budget appropriation to support this work and some of the limitations that you just noted earlier. A couple of questions there. How much has that hampered your ability to undertake investigations? And I'm sure you're aware that a lot of CBOs, groups like the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking and other community-based organizations also work a lot with these populations. Do you have some type of a relationship with them that could help just maybe up the ability of folks to report and address some of these gaps that you just noted?
Yes, great questions. We did not receive a budget appropriation to enforce this law, but again, we also haven't received any complaints. We do have very close relationships with many of the trafficking service providers in the state of California. They also have incentives not to file with DFEH if one of their clients decides to move forward with a civil case. If you can place a case with a pro bono private attorney or law firm, then that law firm may, at the end of the case, if you settle or prevail, donate their attorney's fees, their proceeds, to the organization that's providing support and service to the survivor. We, of course, don't have the authority to do that either. What we collect goes to the victim in terms of damages, but our attorney's fees, we don't have the power to give them to other agencies. So I think that there are structural reasons why the service providers themselves might choose first to place cases with private attorneys before turning to the state, which is why I think that where we're best positioned to intervene is in these group cases, a workplace-wide trafficking situation.
Right, thank you. Yeah, you're right, because as you explained, if you don't have to meet the hurdle, overcome the hurdle of class certification, which can be very, very difficult, all of those elements have to line up in such a way that the court is comfortable in saying, and of course the class certifications are vigorously opposed by those on the other side. So having the ability to essentially declare the class is quite a powerful tool.
And the class certification requirement, thank you, has posed a hurdle in civil trafficking litigation throughout the nation. There's a famous Signal International case that was litigated by the Southern Poverty Law Center in collaboration with a number of other groups and private firms on behalf of more than 500 Indian workers brought in for reconstruction after Hurricane Katrina, where the federal court denied class certification, and then many dozens of individual cases had to be filed to vindicate the interests of the
Right. So if there's no further questions right at this time, then perhaps we can hear from Ms. Plisner. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, I believe Ms. Plisner, I know, was on the call. Are you there?
I am here, yes.
Hello.
All right.
Good.
A little technological hiccup here this morning, but I think we've got it.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank the Commission for inviting the department to today's important hearing. I'm Deputy Attorney General Amanda Plisner, and I'm the DOJ's Statewide Human Trafficking Coordinator. In that role, I oversee all of the work, the anti-trafficking work that the Department of Justice has long prioritized. This includes supervising our human trafficking prosecutions, providing input for an analysis of anti-trafficking legislation, and developing and presenting training to law enforcement, government agencies such as DIR, like you heard from Mr. Forrest just a few minutes ago, and professional groups throughout the state, as well as spearheading DOJ's other anti-trafficking initiatives. For my prepared remarks today, I'd like to start by just highlighting a little bit more, talking a little bit more about DOJ's anti-human trafficking work. The Attorney General has constitutional authority to investigate and prosecute criminal cases, including human trafficking and in turn labor trafficking, and to assist other law enforcement agencies and district attorneys' offices throughout the state with doing the same. In addition to this work, the Attorney General works to combat human trafficking through enforcement of anti-trafficking legislation, including the human trafficking postings required by SB 1193 and the Supply Chain Transparency Act. The Attorney General also takes a leadership role in propelling important anti-trafficking initiatives like the provision of human trafficking education in California's public schools, during which there was significant effort that was ultimately successful to include labor trafficking in that curriculum. The Attorney General completes this range of work with the assistance of the department's Fraud and Special Prosecutions Unit, which prosecutes criminal cases, including human trafficking cases, 2 human trafficking investigative teams, the DOJ-led San Diego Human Trafficking Task Force, and historically, the Tax Recovery and Underground Economy Task Forces, one of which was in Sacramento and one in Los Angeles. Now, the labor trafficking cases that the Attorney General's office handles, either at the investigative or prosecution phases, typically come from either local law enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice Public Information Line, local, state, or federal administrative agencies, such as those agencies with us today, or as referrals from smaller jurisdictions, district attorneys' offices. Once a case is received, the department reviews the details, the specifics of each case to determine whether handling by DOJ is appropriate. Factors that we consider in determining whether it's an appropriate fit include whether the case appears to be multi-jurisdictional in nature, such that the statewide jurisdiction of DOJ's investigators and prosecutors is valuable in that particular case. The availability of specialized resources for that case, such as the forensic auditors that are staffed on the DOJ prosecution teams, the interests of the local prosecution agency who would handle the case if the Department of Justice did not, and whether the investigators and prosecutors in the office have the bandwidth, the room on their caseloads to take on new investigations or prosecutions. Ultimately, the department's goal is to use its finite resources the most effectively and to handle cases where we can be the most impactful. If a case is not retained by the department for one of these reasons, either because the conduct doesn't warrant a criminal prosecution or because it would be best pursued by another agency, it's referred out to another investigative agency or to another prosecutorial agency. For example, if we are unable to determine that there is evidence to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal prosecution standard, the Attorney General may refer the investigation to either the Franchise Tax Board or the Employee Development Department for further consideration. Likewise, if a case comes in directly to the Attorney General's office and it's not multi-jurisdictional in nature, it may be referred to the District Attorney's Office in the jurisdiction where the criminal conduct took place. It's important to note, though, that these partner agencies remain important to the department even when we do maintain a case, because collaborating with these agencies that do a multitude of different things allows us to take a holistic approach, identifying and pursuing all the crimes that have been committed in the course of the trafficking, as opposed to simply filing the trafficking charges on their own. That allows us to paint a more in-depth picture of the criminal conduct and of the offender, and also assures against some of the challenges that we're often faced with when we take a case to court, such as victim cooperation. Now, despite the Attorney General's and the state's efforts to prevent trafficking through education and awareness and to investigate and prosecute offenders, there's certainly barriers to our work. First, labor trafficking cases are unique and resource intensive. As I mentioned, one of the things that determines whether we can take a case is whether we have investigators and prosecutors with the bandwidth to handle those cases the way that they need to be handled. The investigators and prosecutors working on labor trafficking cases in particular, all human trafficking cases, but certainly labor trafficking cases, need to be well trained and to have the adequate time to devote to working their cases. Additionally, these are complex investigations, so they often require the use of specialized investigative equipment and the staff who are knowledgeable in the operation of that equipment. And even in cases where we have all of these things, enforcement efforts may be, and even I would say often are, obstructed by the lack of information sharing among agencies, absent a memorandum of understanding, legislation, or other order that permits that information sharing to take place, as well as by the lack of accurate statistical data to inform and guide our work, which was something that has been mentioned. Just as a point of clarity, the Department of Justice does not collect data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, though I am familiar to some extent with that information. In 2018, which is the last year of complete stats that I have, in the state of California, there were 1,656 human trafficking reports to that hotline. Of those, 151 were labor trafficking, 110 were labor and sex trafficking together, and 169 were unspecified. So possibly labor trafficking, possibly not. What DOJ does collect as far as statistical data is the offender information through the ACHS system. However, that data can only be shared with with public agencies or with bona fide researchers. So that data is, of course, to some degree of limited value to folks outside of the public agency or research spheres. There's no question, however, that more complete data regarding the scope and the nature of the problem would allow us not only to understand, as was mentioned previously, the cost of scaling appropriate enforcement measures, but it would also help us to target our enforcement, for example, to particular regions or particular industries, so that we can more effectively leverage the resources that we do have. In order to overcome
let me just interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
Thank you. Only because I'll forget. So,
okay.
So given what you've told us about the information and where it's kept and how it's siloed and the requirements of MOUs or legislation, what would you be willing to suggest is an appropriate remedy so that we can answer the question How many people are actually investigating and prosecuting human trafficking, and how large a problem is it? As Commissioner Aaroner said, in order to figure out how much to spend on it, you really have to know how big it is. In other words, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So what would be your suggestions, if you can provide some, as to how we would change whatever structure exists so that we have a better structure to get the information to assess how big the problem is?
I think in part that depends whether it would be a one-time data collection or research project, or an ongoing data collection, such as the ACHS, which collects arrest and conviction data on an annual basis, and on an ongoing basis, but then it can be reported annually.
Right.
There's been some suggestion that a prevalence study would be appropriate to at least be a jumping off point to determine what the scope of the problem is that we're dealing with. I would agree that as long as it's appropriately funded to allow us to do, us being, state agencies and anyone else who would be involved, to do a thorough and effective job, that would be a useful tool.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as ongoing reporting, the way I would really see that unfolding would be for there to be some legislative mandate to to law enforcement and or prosecutorial agencies or the judicial branch to report to, let's say, for example, the Department of Justice, those numbers, and then to make sure that the resources are provided to both the reporting agencies as well as the DOJ, who would arguably be maintaining that data to make sure that it could be accomplished.
Right. Good. Well, that's very helpful, because part of what's likely to happen after the hearing is that staff will then have conversations with people in various endeavors and activities to try to come up with a set of recommendations about how you sort of corral and harness this much information. Thank you.
Of course. So in addition to something like a statistical data-driven endeavor, I think one of the other things that's really important to overcoming some of the barriers I've articulated is more standardized collaboration among entities who have human trafficking or labor trafficking touchpoints. As you've heard from DFEH and DIR, we have started that process. I speak to my colleagues at those agencies on a regular basis, and we work closely to make sure that any human trafficking tips that come in that may not be appropriate for one agency or another are ultimately handled and find their way to the state agency that can handle them best. But we're a handful of agencies. There's numerous agencies who do have those human trafficking touch points, and I do believe that a larger scale and more standardized or structured process for that collaboration would be helpful. In addition, and this is something I feel quite strongly about.
This is Dion. Can I interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just at that point, because as I've been listening to the conversation and thinking that you have this kind of interagency task force going, but you don't have the departments that relate to the public as much as you, or as little as you do, right? Lots of the agencies that the state has relationships with at the county level and everything have incredible access to the public. I'm thinking about the Department of Social Services, for example, the Department of Healthcare Services, that see the public on a daily basis, whether they see that public in their homes, they see them in other places. And so that to me is another part of the task force discussion, which is that doing the outreach, the training to those agencies and to their staffs about what they should be looking for, because they are in contact with the public on a regular basis, which you are not. I'm not being critical, I'm just saying it's a reality that the public touches them. Schools touch people, departments of social services touch people, medical offices touch people, clinics touch people. How do you envision how they might be included in such a stakeholder, or whatever you want to call it, process?
Well, let me start by answering your question with the ways that we have collaborated with those agencies so far. So SB 1193, which created the human trafficking poster requirement, was an opportunity for DOJ to sit down with many of those agencies and discuss how it is that they are handling human trafficking work within their agency, because of the enumerated entities that were required to post the human trafficking poster, many of them fall under the purview of those state agencies. So that is something that we did do, and that really allowed us to start the ball rolling on having discussions about ways that the human trafficking work is being done in those agencies, and the ways that the opportunities that there are for collaboration between and among state agencies. For example, suggestions were made by DOJ that agencies that have oversight on entities that are required to post human trafficking posters, that they should be looking for those posters as part of their routine investigations when they go out to do site visits, looking for the things that they typically are going out to look for. In addition, the training component, which you mentioned, is another area where we've had the opportunity to collaborate with other agencies, like the Department of Public Health, if not on the state level, then certainly on the county levels, because there's no question that in the area of human trafficking, there is a huge opportunity with medical providers who would be in a position to identify labor trafficking victims and to be the boots on the ground, so to speak, to have initial contact with those individuals.
Ms. Plisner, I have a follow-up question on that collaboration and the investigations. I'm curious as to, are the investigations done on a periodic basis, a spot basis, surprise basis, and is it categorized by industry, for instance, like the garment industry that might be more prevalent with labor trafficking?
It depends on the regulatory authority of the particular agency. For example, the Department of Public Transportation will have oversight over some of the transportation-related entities that are covered under 1193. ABC will have authority over certain entities that are covered under 1193. So the frequency with which the departments conduct the investigations depends on what their ordinary regulatory authority is.
So for instance, you know, I guess the skeptical lawyer in me says that the people that are probably probably the most egregious in labor trafficking aren't putting posters up. The Transparency in Supply Chains Act really doesn't have any teeth. I think it's more informational than anything. And those are the people that are complying with that are probably the ones that are the good actors. So without all the information, like you said, there's a lack of sharing information. I mean, what's the solution? I mean, how do we find a solution as to find those industries or those businesses that are the actual bad actors, and whether there's an investigatory power or there's some sort of sharing of information to identify those places. And maybe it is starting with one industry and saying, okay, we're going to focus on this industry, and the industry knows that you're going to do something about it. For instance, the garment industry, looking at the financial aspect, what are two businesses that are very similarly situated, charging very different prices in their products, and is there any component of self-regulation of these folks where the good actors do want to level the playing field?
I think there's a multi-part answer to your question. The first thing is that I think the information sharing is critical. For example, the Department of Labor has the ability to access labor complaints. If you have, for example, one adult care facility that has received numerous labor complaints over a course of a period of time, that might be an indication that there's a labor trafficking practice at that particular location. Likewise, if there's, let's say, tax information could be valuable in seeing what or employee EDD related information. How many employers or employees is a particular employer reporting? How many people do they appear to have working for them? How many hours are they saying a particular employee or a set of employees are working? And what do we know about the nature of the products that they're generating or of the services that they're providing? And are those consistent with what they're reporting to state agencies? If not, then perhaps that gap is explained by unfair or exploitative labor practices. The other element that I think is hugely important is government agencies prioritizing collaboration with culturally sensitive advocates and service providers who deeply understand these more vulnerable communities and can effectively liaise with human trafficking victims or people who are at high risk for human trafficking, so that they understand what their rights are and are comfortable participating in the legal processes through which they can seek justice. I think all too often we as government agencies think that we can go at it alone, and even with, there are certain problems like this one that even with the resources, if we had adequate resources, which I don't believe that we do, and that we still need the assistance of these more specialized service providers and advocates who have a different type of understanding, a more deeper understanding of the populations that we're talking about when we talk about the labor trafficking problem. Of course, California needs to prioritize funding the staffing and the training, the individualized resources that each of these entities would need in order to successfully carry out their respective roles. I think one important, really prime example of where funding should be prioritized is the Department of Justice's True Task Forces. Last year, the program was permanently established in law, and in January, the governor's budget proposed funding to ensure that there would be 2 teams that would investigate and prosecute underground economy cases, including labor trafficking. And unfortunately, the proposed funding was withdrawn in the May revised budget, and there's key positions set to expire next month. So now these circumstances create a situation where TRU is in serious jeopardy at a time when the work that it does is the most crucial to the state and to the people who are being pushed underground into the underground economy for the ability to survive, really. Now, that's made worse, I think somebody mentioned earlier, by the COVID-19 pandemic that's unfolded over the last few months. And it's unprecedented circumstances for everybody, but the pandemic and the associated economic disruption really makes devoting adequate resources to the problem increasingly important. The worsening economy exacerbates the circumstances that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking and simultaneously motivates traffickers or would-be traffickers to exploit the rights of others for their own financial gain. And under ordinary circumstances, individuals in California with few economic or employment prospects are often trafficked after they've taken advantage of economic opportunities of last resort. And then you add to that sudden unemployment as a result of a pandemic, and it really creates a situation where many low-wage workers whose prior employment didn't allow them to accrue substantial savings are forced to take whatever work is available in order to survive and put food on the table. Simultaneously, like I said, you've got business owners who are suffering and looking for ways to increase their profit, decrease their overhead, decrease their expenses to recoup some of the loss that they experienced from the shutdown. And that's a recipe for an increase in labor trafficking. Now, the problem is worsened by the fact that the global economy is contracting, not just the California economy. So individuals who may have left their country of origin on one of the types of visas that was discussed previously and come to the United States looking for work may be even less likely to return to their home countries now, because those economies too are contracting perhaps in even a more aggressive fashion than those in California are. And even if they wanted to return home, in many instances they can't due to COVID-19 related travel restrictions. So then they're left to take whatever work is available to them here in California. I'll add to that the social isolation that we're seeing with COVID-19 also increases vulnerability to coercion when you're not engaging with other people and you're not, there's no one else around you who might notice that something is amiss, that your personality has changed, that you aren't in possession of a phone, that you're unable to talk about what you're doing or where you are. And also COVID-19 could be used by a trafficker to justify restrictions that are common mechanisms for labor trafficking, such as you can't leave the house or you can't see your family. So that further complicates a victim's self-identification, which is a common problem in the human trafficking space and the labor trafficking space as well. So despite the resource gaps that remain and the hard work that's left to do, DOJ is proud to be taking a proactive role in the fight against human trafficking, including labor trafficking, particularly during these challenging times. We're committed to pursuing traffickers and seeking justice for survivors, and just as importantly, facilitating a widespread education and preventative measures to prevent others from becoming victims. And that's the end of my prepared remarks for this morning. So I want to again thank the Commission for inviting the department to testify here today. We look forward to continuing to be part of the conversation on this important topic. And in the meantime, I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me open it up to other commissioners. Do you have questions that were prompted by what you just heard? I don't think there's any question that staff is going to be communicating with DOJ about some of the issues that have come up, particularly in terms of coordination, legislative mandates, and trying to come up with ways that encourage and actually require agencies to communicate better with each other. And I suspect that as we look at that, we'll find there are some confidentiality issues that we're going to have to address in order to facilitate that exchange of information. Do I have any other commissioners? If not, we still have another 2 witnesses that we need to hear from. Not hearing any questions. All right, I want to thank you both for your testimony. It's been very, very helpful.
Of course, thanks for having us.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'll then introduce the final 2 witnesses who will both discuss helping labor trafficking victims. We have 2 witnesses on that general topic. The first is Gina Buccieri-Harrington, who is the Assistant Manager for Grants Management at California Office of Emergency Services, and then Lynda Gledhill, who is the Executive Officer of the California Victim Compensation Board. Ms. Buccieri-Harrington has served as Assistant Director for Grants Management at OES for more than a decade. She is responsible for the administration of approximately $807 million in funds for Homeland Security, emergency management, public safety, and victim services programs, a majority of which are distributed to local and regional entities. Commissioners may remember she testified at our earlier hearing on intimate partner violence as well. Ms. Gledhill was recently named as Executive Officer for the Victim Compensation Board. She had filled this role on an interim basis since December of 2019. Prior to that, she was at the Government Operations Agency in the California Senate in a variety of roles, and at the California Attorney General's Office. Both of them have provided written testimony, which was sent to the commissioners. And so with that, Ms. Buccieri-Harrington.
Thank you. Welcome.
I believe she is on the call. Ashley, if we can unmute her.
Yes, she is on the call, and we
There I am. Hi, good morning.
Oh, hello. Welcome. And
looks like I have the beach in the background. Oops,
Yeah,
there we
that.
go.
I
Well,
like,
I'm not at the
I
beach.
like where you're quarantining.
Right, no, I'm actually in my office. That's a great background that Zoom provides. So it's very calming and soothing this morning. Thank you for inviting me back to talk about human trafficking, specifically on labor trafficking. But before I talk about our grant programs, I want to provide you with just a little bit background of what Cal OES's mission is. As you all know, that we're the State Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency, and we oversee a wide spectrum of programs to assist the state in preparing for and responding to and recovering from threats and hazards to public safety. And within Cal OES, it's important to mention that our Homeland Security Directive and Law Enforcement Branch, including our Grants Management and the California Specialized Training Institute, known as CSTI, all work together collaboratively with an approach to addressing human trafficking. While Cal OES does not administer any programs that are dedicated solely to labor trafficking, we have human trafficking grant programs, and we conduct training courses with labor trafficking components through our CSTI, which are for first responders and first identifiers. Cal OES's grants management administers both federal and state funding to community-based organizations and local governments to provide direct services to human trafficking, including labor trafficking. And those services, just so you know, to give you just kind of a little background of what our community-based organizations provide, they do provide comprehensive services to traffic victims, which includes crisis intervention, emergency assistance, 24-hour crisis lines, counseling, emergency shelter, temporary housing, emergency food, clothing, transportation to services for medical appointments. And they also have orientation and complement to the criminal justice process and assist applying for benefits through the California Victims Compensation Board, which you'll be hearing from Lynda on that. Currently, Cal OES has 2 programs that focus on human trafficking, which includes labor trafficking, with 32 grant recipients. We have the Human Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, which is funded entirely on an annual allocation of $10 million in state general fund to support 21 community-based organizations in serving human trafficking. We also have our Human Trafficking Advocacy Program, which is funded entirely by our Federal Victims of Crime Act funds. Cal OES is the state administering agency for Voca, and we fund that program with approximately $1.5 million to 11 county administered victim witness assistance projects that dedicate a specialized advocate to serve the needs of human trafficking. The other programs that we have sent you an attachment and list of our multitude of victim service programs also focus on all crimes and all victims. So some of those programs do focus on human trafficking, but they aren't solely human trafficking programs. We do have 2. And like I said before, it's a combination of commercial sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And in our written testimony, we did supply some statistics from those programs that will identify the labor traffic victims and those who were identified as commercial sex trafficking and labor trafficking combined. And I'm here to answer any questions about those programs that you have for me.
Thank you. It struck me as I was reading your written testimony about the entities that you work with, that being housed in OES, you've got an awful lot of relationships already established with first responders in communities, law enforcement, and others who would, well, you already have those relationships. There's an orientation towards a law enforcement perspective, as well as providing support. I mean, many of the programs that OES funds provide support to people who are victims and survivors in a variety of settings.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what you've heard us ask about is, how big is the problem? How do we measure it? I mean, who should we look to sort of marshal all of the numbers, so to speak? What are your thoughts on that, and whether or not OES already sort of has an infrastructure aligned that way?
We have an infrastructure of, we do collaborate with the we do have an area that provides the training, and also our Homeland Security Directive that oversees the threats of California, which include criminal activity, of course, and threats to us as far as terrorism threats. So as far as collection of data, that's more on the law enforcement preventive. On the collection of services to victims, that's on the grants management side. But we do collaborate, especially on the training courses for the first responders and first identifiers. We do have our victim services staff here provide training in that area. So we do collaborate on the training aspect. As far as the collection of data, and I heard Amanda talk about a comprehensive approach statewide. There is really nothing that has brought all of those statistics together as far as what we accomplish here. We do share our statistics, but what we accomplish here versus what social services does or Department of Justice does or what public health does, that hasn't really been shared comprehensively throughout the state.
Right. So Commissioner Aaron, or I don't know, does that prompt anything?
Well, I mean, you know, at some point, it's going to be, if we can't figure out the size of the problem, I'm getting back to the same point, it's hard to then talk about what the cost of the solutions are, right? I mean, we've heard some testimony at our first hearing from the state of Colorado in regards to doing something about the coordination. And obviously the state has some coordination going on. We've heard about that this morning. The question is, are all of the appropriate players at the table? And data is an important driver of decision making for the legislature to come to grips with, and the administration to come to grips with the size of the problem. It seems to me that we're just not addressing it. We don't know what it is, and so if nothing else, in our report, in our final set of recommendations, it seems to me the data's got to kind of be at the top of the list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Chair Nava, I have a question.
Yeah.
Gina, thank you for your testimony. And I guess we're now seeing a pattern here in terms of the bigger question that underpins this research, which is scale and how we map the problems so that we can find out the solutions. But my question is still related to data, Gina. Do your grantees and even your office conduct impact studies that has to do with like how has the grant making made a significant change in the lives of the survivors, right? Because it helps us, is there any like prevalence of people repeating or being re-trafficked, for example? And my curiosity lies in the impact of some of the solutions that the state and the agencies has offered to help us kind of create benchmark, even in relation to what are the best practices, for example, or successful approaches that the different grantees have engaged in, so that we can see some positive outcomes to some of the solutions that's been preferred by these programs.
We do not, none of our funding that we get here is we're able to do an impact study with or an evaluation. What we do have in our statistics are the progresses of our community-based and local government agencies and the victims that they serve, what services they are being provided, and how many there are. And that's how we can distinguish the impact on looking at if the increase by progress report, if the services have gone up or have gone down or leveled out. But as far as an impact statement, no, we have not done one of those.
So this is Dion again. So that says to me that you're counting, and I'm not being critical, so don't get caught up on my—
No, not absolutely not.
Right, that sounds to me like you're counting the widgets, right? You're saying we know that 17 times a certain service was delivered, but we don't know what its impact was.
Right. We have not conducted an impact study. Correct.
All right. Are we aware of, are there other agencies, other private nonprofits, other states that do impact studies? Does anybody have a clue? Because some of these things are required by the feds, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know who requires the 14 in the domestic violence thing. I think there are 14 services, for example.
Yes.
But
we do collect the services that are mandated. We collect the services, the number of services that are given. But as far as an impact statement, no, I would not know of any other state department that is doing that currently.
Okay. Do we know if it's happening across the nation anywhere where we could get an idea about what an impact, if we wanted to make a recommendation regarding what an impact study should contain? Have we ever—
That would be something we would have to research. I do not have that answer.
That would be great if we could get some help with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me, this is Pedro again. I think Ethan David Byer had a question about Voca funding. Does that ring a bell?
He did. He was interested in the decline in Voca funding. I believe both Voca and VOWA, I believe, although Gina, you will know better than I do.
Yes,
And the reasons for
Voca-
that decline, which I think we discussed also at the IPV hearing, but if you could discuss
He
that.
mentioned, this is Bill Emerson. He mentioned that on page 4 of your report, he had the question as to why the administration has materially decreased its efforts when the amount of human trafficking has increased. Could you address that?
Can you please explain?
He meant by declined or reduced its efforts, he was referring to the decline in Voca funding in the federal administration. That was not a reference to the Newsom administration or to, if I'm correct, Bill.
Yeah, I think
this
that's
is federal funds.
Yeah, correct. He was asking why the Voca funding declined.
Well, the Voca funding is tied to penalties, federal penalties. So if they're not collecting those, of course, that's declined. There is the funding has declined. But to address human trafficking holistically, all our programs that we have do not preclude addressing human trafficking. So though we have 2 dedicated programs, our other multitude of programs that you have a list that we've provided do provide services to human trafficking victims also. So they're inclusive of those. So we have not ignored human trafficking in any measure, that they are part of all of our different programs, our legal assistance programs. There's a list of programs that provide and offer assistance to human trafficking victims.
Right.
So could that be quantified?
I would have to check for you to see if we break out the victim, what victimization comes to those services. I would have to inquire for you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So I think part of the issue with Voca funds is that the feds are not doing as much of prosecution and collection of fines in 2019 and 20 as compared to what they did in 2016. That your understanding as well?
Yes, the reason they opened it up and that we got the increase was because there was such a large amount of money in that fund. But I want to let you know that for us with the decrease, we here, as difficult as it is to maintain, as we talked about in our last testimony, that Director Gledhill wants us to continue with the strong programs that we have. So it's important for us to maintain what we have in a longer term than doing short-term programs that can't be sustained long-term. So we like, as we talked about, a 3 to 5 year. So though the funding is going down, we are doing our best to continue the programs that we have as long as we can. And that is definitely a directive from from Director Gledhill to continue and sustain our programs.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from commissioners?
I just have a follow-up question on the governor's May revision budget. Are we seeing some decrease in funding in this area?
We all got the same May revise, and at this time I cannot speak to where we will be with that at this time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I believe we have another witness.
Correct. Lynda Gledhill, who's the executive officer of the California Victim Compensation Board.
Thank you and welcome.
Lynda, I believe you are muted. I hope at your end, not at our end. Ashley, can you help?
Yeah, she's showing up as that she's not muted.
Lynda, unfortunately, we still cannot hear you. I apologize.
Maybe she needs to turn the volume up.
Perhaps. Lynda, we still cannot hear you. Can you? Ah. Unfortunately, we still can't hear you. Ashley, she shows up as she's unmuted on our end. Is that Lynda?
Yes.
I heard something.
Yeah, I heard something. Lynda? No.
Yeah, she's not showing up as muted on our end.
Commissioners, I apologize. We'll see if we can get this worked out. Lynda, is the volume turned up on your computer? Yes.
Now, this happened to me the first time when
Ashley, why don't you try muting and unmuting her and see what happens?
And she's muted now. Now she's unmuted.
Is that any better?
Yes.
Yay, all right.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, I apologize for that. This is all, it's all new for everybody, and
That's fine.
I came to the office for good internet, and then the audio doesn't work, so that's the way it goes. So thank you all for having me. You have my written testimony. I'm not going to repeat all of it. I just wanted to highlight a few things for CalVCB. As you know, our primary mission is to compensate victims of violent crime who are injured or threatened with injury. We cover a wide variety of those crimes, including domestic violence, sexual assault, homicide, and human trafficking. We're funded through the Restitution Fund and fines and penalties levied on persons who are convicted of crimes. CalVCB is the payer of last resort, which means that if a person meets eligibility criteria, we provide compensation for others who when costs are not covered by other services. And our maximum reimbursement under law is $70,000 per application. And while this hearing is focused on labor trafficking, like you've heard for some other folks, we, for the purposes of compensation, CalVCB does not delineate between victims of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We have one category for human trafficking, and both are eligible for reimbursement. So our data reflects the broader category of human trafficking. And human trafficking was defined as an eligible crime by CalVCB in 2006. Over the past 3 fiscal years, CalVCB has received an average of 170 applications per year from victims of human trafficking. Of these, we were able to determine that an average of 81 applications per year were based on sex trafficking and 20 were based on labor trafficking. The others, the type of trafficking was not specified. About 63% of the victims of human trafficking are represented by advocates who are located in county district attorney's offices, and 16% are represented by community-based organizations that specialize in helping victims of human trafficking. That means that about 80% of the people who apply for compensation are connected to some kind of advocate, which is tremendously helpful for them in order to be able to process through the system and receive compensation. Over the past 3 years, victims of human trafficking received a total of about $90,000 per year in compensation, and about 40% of those who submitted applications never actually received compensation, either because they received money from other sources or they never filed bills with us. The most commonly used benefits are mental health counseling and relocation expenses, and mental health services have increased tremendously over the past few years. And at the beginning of this year, new legislation, which is AB 629, added income loss compensation for victims of human trafficking. Compensation is based on the state's minimum wage rate, up to 40 hours per week, not to exceed $10,000 per year for a maximum of 2 years. Prior to that legislation, income loss was limited to the loss incurred during a period of physical or psychological disability suffered after the crime, and it did not include the time that the victim was actually trafficked. So by July 1, 2020, we will be promulgating regulations to enact that legislation. And so in our observation, the most significant barrier to providing compensation to victims of trafficking is lack of awareness. Victim services is ever evolving, and we are looking to provide increased ways to get messages out to the community and to law enforcement to make sure that they're aware of our services and the benefits that we provide. So advocacy and outreach to first responders and law enforcement and others, as you've all discussed with previous members of this panel, are ways that we can do that. So we have, one of the advantageous things that we have been promoting recently, especially with COVID-19 and everyone staying at home, is our online application. We've increased the number of online applications we've received tremendously. In April, half of the applications we received did come through our online portal. We think that's an important way to get to victims who otherwise might not be able to access our services, or at least during this period of time may not have as easy access to the advocates who would normally help them process the applications. Cal VCB looks forward to continuing to partner with Cal OES and our other partners in state government who work on issues that identify victims and help victims in the state. And we have been doing that. We look forward to continuing to do that. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
I have a question before I open it up to other commissioners. Where are you housed? Where's your home? Your agency?
We're in the Government Operations Agency. Is that your question?
Yes.
Yes, yes, we're within Government Operations Agency.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. Other commissioners?
Hi, Lynda. This is Commissioner Cynthia Buiza. Thank you for joining us today. My question is similar to the one that I asked Gina earlier, but this is in relation to compensation. Do you have, or do your partners have the capacity to track how compensation has led to rehabilitation, for lack of a better word, because I know that that's part of the purpose, is to allow survivors to lead a new and better life. But is there a way to also track that? And again, I think we are asking these kinds of questions because we are honing in on a comprehensive look at how we go from problems to lasting solutions.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think, in terms of what we do, because we are a compensation program that compensates once we receive bills, what we look for is that someone is getting the help that they need and we can support that. So whether it's through relocation or mental health payments, usually the money that they're receiving from us is hopefully going directly to the services that they need to rebuild their lives.
Any other questions by commissioners?
Yes, this is Dion again. So following up on that last question. So it's one thing once again to count how many services were provided and all of those. I think the question really is the outcomes. Do we have studies? Do we know that the combination of services that a victim might receive through the compensation board, that they are now on track to do whatever they were hoping to do? I mean, it's something like that. It's not just a question of what services, it's whether or not the services were effective. The services you purchased for them were effective in helping them to put their lives back together. Do we have those kinds of stories or anecdotal stories or any data that tells us that people, that they could put their lives back together?
Well, we don't track that, and we provide the help that victims tell us that they need to get their lives back on track. I do think there are some advocacy groups, especially in the area of human trafficking, who have done some of that work and may have some people who, and you may have heard from them at your previous hearing, folks who have received services and been able to move on and move on with their lives in a positive way. But that is not something that we currently have.
Right.
This is Commissioner Emerson. What are the sources of your funding for your compensation programs?
So as I mentioned, it's the restitution fund. So that is restitution fees, fines, and penalties that are imposed in criminal court cases.
And that's the only funding source?
At the moment, with this year, it's proposed in the budget is a general fund backfill because the restitution fund has declined to a point where it would not cover our costs. The governor's January budget and again in the May budget provides a $23.5 million backfill to the restitution fund to allow us to fund our programs.
All right, thank you.
Very good. Any other questions, comments?
Commissioner Nava, I think I just wanted to go back to David's point earlier about our report on the underground economy. And it seems to me connecting Amanda's comment earlier, how this public health crisis is going to exacerbate conditions for trafficked individuals. I just want to flag before I forget about it that this may be an opportunity to also integrate, some of the analysis from that report and maybe even, I don't know what context it is we updated, but I think it's very, very relevant to the issues we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and I think part of what we're learning through this testimony is that the various agencies have been charged with providing services and doing an admirable job in providing the services. But what was missing in the original charge or responsibility was follow-up and evaluation, which they're doing what they've been asked to do. They, provide services, distribute funds, assist people who desperately need help. But I think what we're asking as Little Hoover Commission is for that money, isn't there another part that needs to be done, which is the assessment of its efficacy? So I just want to make sure that everybody who has participated understands we're being critical of what you do and how you do it. What we're looking for is probably the next step, and how we fashion recommendations that actually evaluate how effective and efficient and helpful those various steps are. I think that's part of what we're digging at. But I want to make sure that everybody who participated here understands that we're not being, critical of how they're doing their work. They're doing their work the way that they've been charged with having to do it. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? I don't hear any. Thank you, very much for your testimony. And Ethan, if you can take us to, the next step here.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. The last item on the agenda is public comment. Rachel, if you can put up on the screen the instructions for how people can make public comment. If you are on the Zoom call, you may use the raise hand function, as you can see there. If you have called in, or if you're on Zoom, either way, you can email us at littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. The email is on your screen now. We will check that in real time. And members of the public can indicate they wish to make public comment. If you email us, tell us the phone number you're calling from so that we may unmute you. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes, which is what we do during physical meetings. So we're enforcing that rule as well on Zoom today. So please limit your comments, if you have any, to 3 minutes. Rachel or Ashley, I believe you are checking to see, is there anyone who has indicated from the public they wish to make public comment?
Yeah, we have a few people on Zoom that are in the queue to make public comment.
Okay, Ashley, I'll turn it over to you then, and you can identify them and Perfect. Go ahead.
So I will close this.
And I should mention that to members of the public, if you're making public comment, we will turn your audio on. The commissioners will not be able to see you, but they will be able to hear you. So I'm sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
All right, we will start with Emily Sims. Emily, I am now starting your ability to talk.
Hello all, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Hi, good morning. My name is Emily, and I'm a case manager at Justice at Last. We're Northern California's only pro bono legal firm, and we mainly represent victims' rights in court, sometimes alongside prosecutors, but sometimes solely in civil cases. I am also someone who identifies as a survivor of this crime, and I really just wanted to thank you all. It's quite rare that I hear words like trauma-informed being used that are then actually very much implemented. So from my perspective as a survivor and someone who's done this work for about 20 years, I just really commend you all for the inclusiveness of this research. I think it was also done, and this conversation is being done in a very non-punitive way, and understanding why some survivors would be fearful of prosecution, and addressing really the various needs that can be done in civil remedies. Something that I also really appreciate was taking the hyper focus off of sex trafficking. While that is an egregious crime and what I experienced, I think that sometimes it overshadows the more hidden exploitation that exists in agriculture, restaurants, nursing homes. And I think right now with COVID too, there's the particular risk for folks that are working in caregiving positions who don't have access to PPE. So that's something that we're gonna be really trying to stay on task with. And I guess it's mostly just a huge thank you as a service provider and a survivor for the work that you're doing. It's very appreciated by myself and our agency.
Thank you, Ms. Sims.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Next, we have Dana Falkowski. Dana, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Thank you. Am I on?
You are.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm Dana Falkowski. I am a prosecutor with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. I've been with the office for 24 years. I currently run our grant-funded human trafficking prosecution unit. We received a federal grant that requires us to enhance our collaborative efforts with state, federal agencies, as well as victim service providers. We received that grant in October of 2018. We spent our first year doing sex trafficking because it's easier to find and prosecute. Effective January of 2018, we added a sex trafficking prosecutor, and I became the county's first labor trafficking prosecutor. I will tell you what we need to do this work in local prosecution. If the Attorney General's office referred me a case, I wouldn't know how to prosecute it. We have federal resources that can tell us what the federal laws are, but they can't tell me how to prosecute a state labor trafficking case. There are no published cases dealing with labor trafficking under Penal Code Section 236.1. I have filed the county's first labor trafficking case a week ago. It is a domestic servitude case. It was prosecuted by one of Contra Costa's 26 different local law enforcement agencies, a very small agency that had a federal partner. This agency believed the case would go federal, and the U.S. Attorney's Office passed on it. They came to me, it was under investigated, and I had no idea how to prosecute it. I looked at the statute, and what I learned was I needed to understand not just the labor code, I needed to understand 18 different wage orders that are maintained by the Department of Industrial Relations. They were created by the now defunded Industrial Welfare Commission. Those different orders give us the rules for various entities of employment, including Rule 15, which governs domestic employers and addresses what I needed to understand about domestic servitude. The idea that if the victim agrees to her working conditions, there is no crime, is widely held in law enforcement, by victim service providers, and by prosecutors. That's why we don't have any state prosecutions for labor trafficking that are published cases. If my local law enforcement agencies can't understand how this is a crime, then the victims can't understand what to say to generate an investigation, and the investigation can't come to me and generate an effective prosecution. What we need is training for local law enforcement and county prosecutors about state law and where we find it. A 2019 case explained to me that those orders are still valid and they have the force of law. That case is can be found at 40 Cal App 5th, 359. It's Liday, Liday versus Sim. The other thing that we need is an easier access point for state and local officials for accessing the authority and the state agencies that can help us understand that authority so that we can calculate the value of the victim's labor. I have Marcy's Law. It lets me give restitution for all economic losses. But if I don't understand how to value the worker's labor, I can't do that. And the other thing that we need that your Attorney General prosecutor pointed out was resources. Local law enforcement and local prosecutors' offices do not understand how to evaluate and analyze financial crimes. I need the ability to work with a financial or a forensic auditor to do the financial analysis in order to build strong cases that are prosecutable. So thank you very much for allowing me to make those comments. Very much appreciate it.
Hi, this is Pedro Nava. I want to thank you for being so clear and specific about what needs to be done. If you are a 24-year prosecutor and you're telling us that you don't have enough training and direction in this particular kind of crime to feel comfortable and confident about pursuing it, I can't imagine that a prosecutor with 1 or 2 or 3 years of experience is even going to have any notion whatever where to look and where to get the information. This has been very helpful. Thank you.
Can we ask,
Commissioner,
can we ask her to
I
please give
want
us a testimony in writing?
I'm sorry?
I want to be sure we can get your testimony in writing.
Oh, I will happily do that.
Thank you.
We will, Commissioner Arundel, we will follow up at the staff level with Ms. Falkowski to get written comments and more details.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
just a note to include, if it's possible, Dana, how widespread do you think this is?
I think it is phenomenally underreported for all of the reasons I've given, and I will include that in my testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as I said, Ms. Falkowski, we will follow up with you at the staff level. So Ashley, if you can go on to the next public comment person, please.
Yes, thank you. And we will now move on to Stephanie. Stephanie, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Ashley, is there a last name? Is it Stephanie?
Hi, hi. My name is Stephanie Richard. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We
Okay,
can,
great.
Stephanie. Thank you.
I did just, I want to make a separate point on labor trafficking in the time of COVID, but just to follow up on the prosecutor's last comments, I am aware of 5 different labor trafficking cases a prosecutor under state law, 3 in Los Angeles, California, 1 in Sacramento and 1 in Fresno. The local prosecutor, please contact me directly and I can connect you to those 3 prosecutors that I've worked with and provided expert testimony in if you need it. But I think what I want to highlight is that you see labor trafficking prosecution when there is people assigned to it specially. So what happens is that the sex trafficking cases are, overwhelming and will pull both law enforcement and the DA's office to focus exclusively on that. And so, like in Los Angeles, we only saw labor trafficking prosecutions when they dedicated 3 LA City police officers to investigating that. And the same thing, it's great to hear that, there's a DA's office and the position is labor trafficking specific. For example, we do not have a labor trafficking position in LA County, despite having, I think, 5 sex trafficking prosecutors. Again, we need those resources as well. So that's just a little bit on the need for dedicated folks with the specialization. I also want to say that at a federal level, what I've seen successful in making sure that victims are ordered restitution is good collaboration between Department of Labor and Department of Justice. And they help calculate the wages that are allowed for as part of restitution, because that isn't commonly a prosecutor's case. So encouraging that good partnership between the labor commissioner that testified today and local and state prosecutors is super important, because we do have good state laws that explicitly tell you how you can calculate restitution since 2005, actually. And so it's a good provision. It's just underutilized, and CAS does a lot of work training prosecutors, and we do have template documents on how to ask for restitution in labor cases. Okay, so that's sort of the prosecution aspect, but because of, we've all sort of experienced this shift, right, in the policy realm and what's feasible because of the global pandemic we're using, and this is the first hearing that Little Hoover has had. I just want to emphasize that the need for resources to prevent and then protect the expected increases that we will see due to the pandemic in labor trafficking is paramount. So we have submitted a request to the governor for $30 million. That's additional $21 million in specialized services to augment the 21 service providers already funded by Cal OES, as well as $3 million additionally for a statewide task force to create easier ways for especially recently unemployed who we believe will be recruited into trafficking situations to reach out for help. So a statewide task line, and then $6 million for really on the ground increased prevention efforts. And this is to
I think we lost her.
Yeah, we lost her. Stephanie, you're a little bit over the 3 minutes. If you can wrap up very quickly, please.
Okay, yeah. So there is documented good evidence that trafficking does increase in the time of crises. We saw this with Hurricane Katrina and in Louisiana and in Texas. And so, and the vulnerable industries are home health care, elder care, construction, agriculture. All of these are essential services and are really, really prone to exploitation right now. Thank you.
Thank
you very much, Ms. Richards.
That is all that we have right now for public comment.
And Rachel, I believe Ashley, are you checking the email, or is Rachel checking that?
Rachel is checking the email.
Okay. Rachel, do we have anyone who's emailed us?
No, we have not received any requests for comment over email.
Oh, we just got one request for public comment on Zoom.
Okay.
Caroline, I am now starting your ability to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Great, thank you. I'm very overwhelmed with these Zoom presentations, but I want to thank the Little Hoover Committee Commission actually for including us. My experiences as an American citizen, and I hope that Mr. Rarick is sharing all our written documentation because there's a lot. We cannot compile this all in 3 minutes, and I wish I could give comments to the presenters or the witnesses, but I've used all these agencies, and unfortunately nothing helps. And I know that in my opinion, it's a mechanism used to actually intentionally hiding our evidence, and I can substantiate it. I have done so already with a summary, but it's a failed system. We don't have a budget problem because, as we've seen, there's an expansion of government employees, and as long as they're silenced and told what to do and what not to do, I'm sorry, you will not find a solution. And so I need to continue this advocacy because it's, like you said, it's only getting worse. The VCs have already announced that they're now investing in caregiving and au pair services. And this is right here in my neighborhood, Silicon Valley, with Sand Hill Restaurant. We know what's going on there on Thursday nights with sex trafficking. We know which cultures are most involved in this. It's sad, and it's really a shame that all our elected officials have known this for a very long time, and they just pay their employees, which is sad to say, just to ignore our concerns, to not even allow us to speak with them. And when we speak with them during town hall meetings, they just turn around and just ignore the problem. It's very sad. The coronavirus, yes, it's an epidemic. And I fear that some more will come because there's intentional political agenda here. And we have too much at stake here in Silicon Valley that wants to gain political power. But a lot of what I have mentioned in my summary could have been prevented. I have worked with several organizations who...
Ms. Vertognan, I'm sorry, but you have reached your 3 minutes, and so we'd ask you to keep your public comment to 3 minutes.
But you're sharing all my written documentation, are you?
We've received your documentation, so.
And are you sharing it with all the commissioners?
We don't share all documents that are sent to us. We receive many documents, but Ms. Vertognan, I'll be happy to respond separately to you, but your public comment period is over. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I do not believe we have any other, Ashley, unless we have other public comment requests.
No, we do not have any other public comment requests.
All right, so let's close the public comment period. Let me turn back to the commissioners. Are there any, closing remarks or comments, observations anyone wishes to make before we can conclude the meeting?
Chairman, this is Commissioner Buiza. I think we actually made some inroads in terms of expanding the research a little bit more. I know it's already a very thoroughly reviewed, written document, but the issues around scale, around infrastructure, around lasting solutions, around impact, this will all enrich the report. And so I'm very grateful for the questions from the other commissioners, but also for the quality of testimonies that we have gotten. I think we had almost 101 participants at the peak of our hearing. That's one of the bigger hearings.
Yes. So I want to thank both you and Commissioner Aaroner.
And I'd like to thank everybody who provided testimony today. I thought what was wonderful was the testifiers kind of connecting with each other, which is, makes me feel like we can make some real progress here, not just with our report, but by it being able to bring people together. And I would like to say, I would like to see the testimony of the last testifier. I just think that it's important for us to hear from people who feel that the system is not working for them, so that we can see how, what the issues were there and how do they mesh with what we heard today and what we heard at our other hearings, that kind of thing, and in our advisory committee. I think that would be helpful. But thank you. Really, the testimony was excellent today.
Yeah, let me express my appreciation to staff pulling all the technology together. And I think as we do this, we'll get better at it. And as soon as we figure it out, then they'll open it up and we won't have to do it anymore. But in any event, please, everyone, stay well, be safe, and we'll talk again soon. Mr. Eric.
Thank you. I think we can close the hearing. We will be, commissioners, I'll be following up with you on scheduling additional business meetings and public hearings on topics that we've discussed in the past. So we'll be following up on more scheduling. But other than that, I think, Mr. Chairman, we can close the hearing. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Goodbye, all.
Thank you.
Bye.